ideas. These occultic mystery things are sitting in the very bowels of basically the church these days in so many ways. It's interesting because even when you get into, Catholics are really anti-Freemasons. Why are they so anti-Freemasons? Well, basically, Freemasons, a lot of them really kind of came out of the pagan, Jesuit, occultic kind of scene that was going on there. And they said, well, we don't want the church to rule over us, so we're going to free ourselves, from that. And we are going to, from the Hospitallers and these, these groups that came out of the Crusades and everything else. Well, these guys want to cut off from this kind of stuff and say, well, we want the milk, but we don't want to buy the cow. We want all of these kind of occultic mystery, kind of synchronistic, where we're lining everything up together and we're finding the thread, the golden thread, because we're going to create a golden dawn out of this, and we're going to become illuminated. And from that was, Adam Weishaupt, of Bavaria, and you had, these groups that were coming out of the Babylonian kind of churchcraft that was going on there, and basically it was taking all authority from that entity, from the Catholic entity. And so it became a very bitter struggle. So there was a huge anti kind of Templars and Freemason kind of thing, because they were taking what held power over the people, and they themselves were creating these revolutionary movements, the Jacobites and everything else, and that started the French Revolution and everything else. And the Illuminati and all of this. And so believe me, I'm not calling them the good guys. I'm just saying that it really was a kind of an escaped creature from their own zoo, in which they're trying to get back and put back in the cage. And it becomes this huge kind of, basically they're in cahoots in kind of a spiritual sense, but in some ways I think they see themselves as opposed to each other. Well, we shouldn't be in these paradigms. Christianity is simple and fundamental. It's to stay away from the concept of these esoteric Egyptian / Babylonian / whatever / ideas, and to come back into the fundamentals of Scripture. How do we interpret the Scripture rightly? How do we stay away from even terms like hermeneutics? Let's just call it biblical interpretation. Well, as you could see throughout the New Testament, the way that the Bible interprets itself, it's interesting. Just go through the New Testament and take all the areas that there are quotes from the Old Testament, and virtually almost every single one of them, almost without exception, is in direct reference to the person and the work and the ministry of Christ himself. Almost never is it a primary focus upon ourselves. And we're talking about scriptures in the Old Testament that you would not have normally or thought conventionally to apply them to the Messiah. You thought, no, this applies to Israel. This applies to, this king, or this applies to, this event that happened with Isaiah or whatever. His wife, had a baby, so, from a virgin a child is born, or even a situation of Samson where he says, I thirst, and Christ is up on the cross saying, I thirst, or that the Messiah would be a Nazarite. Where does it say he'd be a Nazarite? Well, in the life of Samson, So it's things that you would have never understood to be messianic, Christ-centered, giving the tale and the story about the person and the work of Christ. Well, that is the laws of interpretation that the New Testament writers used, especially John in the book of Revelation. He completely uses that motif to give us the laws of interpretation. So you don't need a big, long, complicated, education at a seminary, at a university amongst your collegians in the college, right? That was all, by the way, pagan class clergy system, the mystery schools, and you went to these elite places and you learned these, secret crafts and sciences and all this other kind of stuff. Well, we're supposed to not be participating in those things. We are to get back to something that can be understood. We are to be as the Bereans. Go with a Christ-centered approach of things first and foremost. Look at the typology in Scripture. Stick with that. And see that Christ is the superstar of the whole thing. And we are to see it as that. And then we could lay out our eschatology. I hate to use that term because that's a Greek, Hellenistic term of the schools and laws of interpretation. It just means really The book of Revelation is a very Hebraic way of thinking. God thinks, and this is important to understand this, God takes the history, Genesis, Numbers, the Kings, takes the history, even the Gospels, takes those things that had happened before as if they came out of the end. They came out of the final chapter. Those things were only playing out the final chapter. The final chapter is the ultimate. The final chapter is what has been dictating these earlier kind of playing out. But it ultimately comes down to this great super gravitational reality, and it centers down to Christ in person and his battle with his archenemy, Satan, and that there's going to come an end. And the conclusion is that Christ will swallow up darkness and death with his light and life, and will create a new heaven, a new earth, and he will sustain and contain all those things in himself. And anybody that's in covenant with him will be truly living that everlasting life. If you don't understand that from the book of Revelation, you don't understand it. Now, what I'm saying is be careful. Be careful of that counterfeit system, not just in church membership, to not be a Catholic or to find out what churches aren't keeping the Sabbath holy or not keeping the laws. Now, that's one way to do it, but you can be in a Sabbath-keeping church, and yet they have the same principles, the same laws of social kind of contract, and the same way of how they deal with the laity as that Pergamus system, as the early kind of brew and pot that created the Catholic system. You can have that today, and that is today. The same social conditions, the same intellectual conditions, the same political conditions, the same circumstances are being repeated in a global sense today. And we have to understand that these are the early makings of what made the Catholic system what it is. A system that gave another face, another interpretation, another understanding, but it's earthly, it's sensual, it's devilish. We're in a crusade mentality now. We think it's okay to go to war with everybody, that it's okay now for Christians to pick up arms and to be beating war drums. And the Christians are going with that. We celebrate this idea that we're at war and that it's okay to be in this new, battle against the jihad, and we've set up, our perfect enemies, and we're out there fighting this war, and now America is going to be the great militaristic arm of this, the one that's going to be able to really be in the hand of the great power that has always been the leader of the Crusades, that have always had inquisitional power, that have basically infiltrated all of our systems. And now America is going to be the authoritative power to enforce this worldwide global paradigm. It's so important to really lay a hold of this because the church is playing along. And as I said, you could not have the label of being Catholic. You could not have the label of being an apostate Sunday-keeping church, that believes in all this Mithraism, but you could still, in some sense, in a sociological, political, and in the essence of your relationship to the leadership and to yourself, be of the Nicolaitans, the conquered laity. So it's important we get a hold of these things and lay a hold of this. And so what I'd like to do is encourage you to go back and take the basic laws of interpretation, to go back to a Christ-centered understanding of things and see Christ in all of his glory, but because by beholding him and seeing him in all of his majesty and in all the details, by beholding, you become changed and you become ready to face him face to face at his soon return. Thanks for joining.